All right, let's start the session. Good evening, one and all present here. We are here for the week 3 live session of the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. The course instructor is Dr. Harshit Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Roorkee. So we have two of these live interaction sessions. One is on Saturdays. That's the first session by Ms. Isha Rathore. She is a PMRF and research scholar, also from IIT Roorkee. I am Monica S. I am handling the second session of the week. I am also a PMRF and research scholar. I am from the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Kharagpur. So this is part of a collaboration between mm, PMRF and the NPTEL team, uh, wherein the live interaction sessions every week for the NPTEL courses, especially the rerun courses, are being handled by some of the PMRF. So PMRF is Prime Minister's Research Fellowship um, for the students who come under the fellowship. So we have two of these sessions. We have two of these sessions, two forums where you can actually essentially interact with the course instructors as well as the additional TAs that you have. One is the doubts and interaction sessions during the weekly live session. So we have two of them. Mine is every Tuesday, 6 to 8 p.m. So what we'll be doing is after every question or after a few questions, I would be prompting as to whether you have any queries, wherein you can raise your hand. There is a raise hand option in Google Meet. You can raise your hand, unmute, and you can raise your queries. Uh, the questions can also be posted in the chat box, which will be addressed in due course of the session. But we also have a discussion forum for the course. Any questions related to the live sessions can be raised there. Even otherwise, questions, uh, general questions can also be raised there. It will be addressed either by the core team or by us. We might also end up addressing some of these questions in the subsequent live sessions. Right. So right now, so this week we'll be doing a very short recap of what was taught in the week's lectures. Then we'll be looking at assignment questions. We'll have a few explanations and some related additional content. This week, we do not have any particular queries from the discussion forum as such. So that will not be there. That's a section because the questions, uh, there are questions that have already been addressed or those pertaining to the next week, right? So therefore, those have not been addressed today. So then we'll also be looking at the current run week 3 assignment questions again with a few explanations and discussions. So going for a short recap of the week's course content. So the first lecture of the week, or the first two lectures actually, focused on World Sustainable Development Timeline. So this is something that has been majorly sourced from the Asian Development Bank's timeline report that was released. So the lecture 11 focused on 1970 to 1999 and lecture 12 focused on the period between 2000 to 2021. So please note that the report actually stops by 2012. So which means you'll have to exclusively rely on the lecture contents for the rest. Lecture 13 focused on EIA as in it's the law, policy and institutional arrangements for EIA system. Lectures 14 and 15 focused on the particular domain of air when it comes to these arrangements, laws, and policies that are available for EEA system at both the global as well as the local, the national level in India. Right. So, giving you an idea as to how the report looks. So, even while I was going through the lecture, it's a lot of dates and a lot of years and a lot of events to remember, right? So, this particular report is actually a very good resource for you to start with. It covers almost all of the points that have been covered in the lectures, right? It starts from the 40s, but we will be completing only this timeline, right? So I will show you. So this is the report. Starts from the 1940s, but we'll be starting from the year 1970, right? If you notice, yeah. So this is where all the content comes in from. So I think we started actually around 1973, if I'm not wrong. So we start with the UN clause in the lectures, right? So most of them are covered here. Some additional content is also present in this, which you need not cover. Please remember that. So not all of these points are required. However, most of the points are covered here. Also remember some points are not covered in these as well. So for example, I think the convention on EIA is not covered in this report. So please do not rely on this report exclusively, but yes, it is a good tool at the end of the day to sort of for your preparation, right? And in lecture 13, we saw key trends in the development of EAA system, foundations of an effective EAA system, framework from a legal perspective, enabling environment for EIA and sustainability, and relevance and concepts. Lecture 14, which 14 and 15 focused on air. So like under lecture 14, we saw key concepts of policies, forms of governance approaches and policy instruments regarding air, and global environmental agreements, again focusing on air, which is relevant to climate change, stratospheric O3 depletion, and PVT. So we also had in lecture 15 a few key international guidelines and standards were covered. Right. So another good way of preparing for the entire week's content, especially the first two lectures, is to use these infographics or timelines that are readily available online, right? They come in to be very, very handy because someone is unmuted. Can you mute yourself, please? Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. So these tools also sort of come in handy for you to be able to prepare for the content because it it is a lot of years and it is a lot of convention names. However, almost all of them that have been cited or mentioned are actually very, very important convention. And anything pertaining to the environment, any course pertaining to the environment, uh, immaterial of the focus area sort of focus area sort of cover these aspects, right? So make sure you can use some of these tools for preparation, right? Before we move on to the assignment questions from the previous one, were there any queries that were generally present? Anything that you need to ask before I go into the rest of the session? Okay, if not, then we'll just continue with the questions. So you know the format, right? So for each question, please give your answers in the chat box. It's okay if it is wrong, right? Nobody's assessing. It's more of an exercise for you to sort of recall what is happening. Right? Let's go to the first question of the week. Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit 1992 is an example of A, non-binding instruments, or B, binding instruments. Any responses? Okay, my internet is bad, so I'm going to switch off my video. All right, so the answer is actually directly lifted from the slides. Uh, this Rio Earth Summit is actually not a legally binding one, right? So there are two types of instruments in general when it comes to environmental movement. So one is non-binding, the other is binding instrument. What is the difference? So non-binding instruments are essentially those that are there's no legal obligation to follow through. Nobody's going to punish you if you do not meet to the guidelines. It's more of a guideline or a like a recommendation of sorts. However, it's strongly recommended that countries do follow them, right? But binding instruments are those that actually come with an obligation that you're actually supposed to follow it through, right? So in the international environmental law and policy that are of relevance to EIA, one example of a non-binding instrument is the Rio Declaration, but a binding instrument would be the ESPO Convention. So if a country has actually ratified this and said, okay, you know what, we are going to sort of follow this um, particular convention and its uh, agreements, then we have to follow through. Like it's a legal binding thing, right? However, even within ESPO, there are two things. The first clause, if you remember, that EIA will be conducted is legally binding. The second clause is actually not legally binding. That is also a recommendation where countries voluntarily sort of come up and say, okay, if there is something of a major issue that is going to be a transboundary issue, then we will bring it to the assessment of all countries involved. So it's more of a collaborative effort. The collaborative part is mildly, less intensive. So the answer here is A. It is a non-binding instrument. So when it comes to the Paris Agreement, is it binding or non-binding? It is a binding instrument. However, one major, you know, concern that has come up time and again is how there is no enforcement mechanism. So yes, it says that okay, you have to follow this, but what if people don't? Then there is nothing. There is no punishment clause, or there is no real consequence apart from say, the country being labeled as a defaulter practically. So there is actually no hard and fast enforcement rule that's coming up, right? So that's an example of, in fact, most international treaties, especially the climate treaties, it's difficult to come to an agreement if there are enforcement clauses. Most countries will just deny, and that might end up becoming counterproductive. Right? So, any queries here? Okay, we'll move on to the next question. The statement environment impact assessment as a national instrument shall be undertaken for proposed activities that are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment and are subject to a decision of a competent national authority is covered under which principle of UNFC, UNFCC action, triple C. Any answers? Just jog your mind. I mean, from what you've seen from the lectures. Yes, we have a raised hand. Go ahead, unmute yourself, please. Who is it? Okay, we have a few answers. Okay, okay. So if you remember from the slides, the answer is actually principle 17. Okay, so it's a direct quote from the slide. The thing is, these are aspects, you need not remember them verbatim if you ask me, but these underlying parts are very, very important for you to remember. Both these principles are the key things, key principles that point out to EIA, right? So you need to remember that it's principle 17 and principle 15. right? But right now the answer is principle 17. So the answer is A. All right. Any queries here? Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This is an interesting one. Chernobyl accident is related with A, earthquake, B, tsunami, C, toxic radioactive explosion, and D, fire. Any responses? Okay, we have a few answers, and all of you are right. So the Chernobyl incident is a toxic radioactive explosion in a nuclear station. It happened in then USSR, actually, like probably current territory of Ukraine. So the answer is C. So let's take a look at what actually happened in the disaster, right? Like, let's take a small look. It's been quite some time now. Uh, Despite so many years, so many decades having passed, it's one of the most spoken about nuclear disasters in the history of in recent history. So yes, it has been 36 years as of this infographic, but even then, as of this period that is being spoken about, the effects were still being seen, right? So what basically happened was in like somewhere near Kiev, uh, we had this nuclear plant where I think one of the systems was shut down for a routine safety test, but the test sort of went out of control and there was an explosion that occurred at reactor 4. So it was quite a disaster. It happened on April 26th of 1986. So there was a 2,000-ton roof that was blown off in the explosion, and 8 tons of radioactive fuel were released into the atmosphere. It is almost 400 times as much radioactive material as the Hiroshima atomic bomb, if you remember from the World War. So toxic clouds sort of, because of the circulation pattern, toxic clouds reached as far as US, Canada, and Japan. So even though it happened in Ukraine, of course, then USSR, and a huge area, like nearly 1,55,000 square kilometers was affected, and agricultural land around this was rendered useless for about 30 years. Like that's a very substantial period, right? And 4,000 people are estimated to have died. However, death is one thing. Morbidity, as in you having diseases, having direct impact from the explosion, they were very high, right? And cancer rates have increased in the region very highly after the disaster, again, understandably. So right now, so back then they sort of uh, when this happened, they dropped thousands of tons of lead and sand to sort of, put down the fires. But very immediately, they built this structure. You see here, right, right after the accident. So it still is somewhat functional and it contains like 95% of the radioactive material. However, there is a new confinement that has been planned, right? So this is sort of a map too. So this is Europe. If you notice, that's UK, Russia. Right? If you notice the extent of damage, so that's like the maximum damage point. From here, the map just shows how the damage spread. And this is again, it's based on how much air movement is there, airflow was there, which all areas were highly affected. So this is not the only nuclear disaster that happened. So all the yellow dots that you see are all the nuclear plants that are present in the world, and all the blue points. I can't find my marker. Yeah, all the blue circles are all points of disasters, right? So even though nuclear energy is sort of dubbed to be a very clean fuel because emissions are like a low, the risk that comes with it is very, very high, which is why it's still very highly debated. And it's not just a matter of, the risk that comes with it. Uranium mining, so throughout the process, it's not just about the nuclear plant as such, right? It's also about what happens. So, say you need some kind of radioactive material to uh, to be used in the plant, and then you end up mining it. So what happens during that mining, all of these points, or when you have waste disposal, so what beyond a point the radioactive material is not of use, how do you dispose it of? You There are certain protocols, but are those protocols being followed? All of these are issues related with nuclear energy. So it has its pluses and minuses, and there is quite a bit of debate going on around this. And India has its, again, huge share of nuclear reactors. So the other major incident that again is very widely spoken about is the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster. Right. So this is a small image. So this is the world. This is the world map in a very distorted way. I don't know why they chose to do this. If you see, this is Africa, this is India. So it's a very different projection. Okay, it's not a standard projection. So that's Brazil, that's USA, right? So these triangle sort of show highly toxic sludge residue, tailings, and waste rock dumps. So tailings are when you have an ore, and then there is residue in the ore. So when you mine for something and you essentially expose the uranium, right? Uranium is very radioactive, and radioactivity is extremely harmful to life, any life form. And that's the case when it's in the form of an ore. It's concealed and it's contained in some natural way. When you're mining it and then you leave the mine exposed, what happens is the uranium starts leaking, and even in the process of mining you end up, there are spillages, etc. So these triangles sort of indicate the toxic residue, either from mining or from spillage, that are sort of present in these countries, right? So I know India's triangle is less, but the impact is still going to be considerable. Right? Also, the pink countries are countries where we do not have data about. So that's not encouraging either. So the other issue, like I said, not just mining, post utilization in the plant, there is the matter of nuclear waste disposal. So if you notice again, this is India, right? This is Africa, and this is the US. These black dots are sort of the points where uh, nuclear waste dumping has happened, and these are like the major clusters of nuclear waste dumping. So there is a protocol for nuclear waste dumping. Actually, you're supposed to be dumping it during tectonic plate movement, if I'm not wrong, but people don't really follow it. That's the issue. And this is a graph showing like Atlantic, Arctic Sea, and Pacific Ocean. So, who are the major dumpers of nuclear waste? That's just a bit of extra information. So, even in the Ukraine war, if you remember, like the current war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia, there is substantial risk of nuclear disaster because there are quite a few reactors in Ukraine, and as Russia keeps bombing, there is always the issue of a nuclear disaster breaking again. So that's going to be tremendously problematic for Ukraine, right? Any queries here? This is just a bit of general context so that you remember what's happening. Okay, moving on to the next question. Under which reference the term cap and trade is used? Emission trading, forex trading, energy trading, all of the above. Any answers? Okay, since we don't have any answers, then we move on to the slide. So this is a slide where emission trading has been mentioned. So it talks about carbon market. and how it's there for countries to trade emission units and encourage sustainable development under a system known as cap and trade. So this is essentially emission trading, right? So the answer is A, emission trading. But let's delve a little bit more into what emission trading is. I mean, there is barely any explanation within the lecture itself. So let's know a bit more so that the concept is clear. So essentially, okay, this is a better starting point. Actually. Essentially, uh, in order to limit the amount of pollution in the environment, uh, there have been conventions where there is a recommendation for limiting greenhouse gas emissions, right? Or any kind of emission for that matter. So, all kinds of pollutants. So, what happens is some country or in some jurisdiction, they end up placing a cap. They say, okay, you know what, this is the limit of emissions. You cannot emit more than this, right? And you need a permit. So, you need to get permits, and the permit issued will be up to this. This is the limit where you can emit something. Say there is a factory A, and what they are doing is they they can emit till here, right? But what they end up doing is they're only emitting till here. So they have a surplus. So they can emit some more, but they're not really emitting, which means they're saving up, right? And there is a factory B which is emitting more than what they're permitted to emit, right? So what they can do is, since factory A is actually limiting its emissions, right? It's saying, okay, you know what? I've upgraded my technology so that my emissions are limited. They can sell this, the excess permit that they have, they can sell it to this guy in exchange for money, right? So, rather, the arrow is this way, not this way. They can pay them. Factory B can pay A so that they can gain some monetization. So if you look at this, say this factory has three emissions, right, and only one permit, okay, or rather they have three times their permits that are like left over. What say these guys have three permits but only one emission. It depends on the size of the factory, the type of the factory, all of these things. So there'll be differences in how much emission is allowed, right? So what they do is these two are excess, they just sell it off to them so that they can actually end up, emitting this much without any consequence, legal consequence. So that's the concept of emission trading. So if you look at it generally, there are several countries that have implemented this. One particular system is in California. California is actually collaborating with Quebec. Quebec is a region in Canada, which is actually weird. They're not close to each other, but they are collaborating on this effort. So they've actually made a cap, but this cap sort of keeps dropping. So it's not a standard cap either. So they have a slightly modified system. So they want to make sure the emissions keep going lower, right? So every year you will have to like you will have lesser and lesser permission to emit. So that's the cap. And trading is, of course, you can trade between countries, right? So this is a map as to showing all the arrangements that is there in the carbon market. So carbon trading actually consists of two major instruments, like they call it. One is ETS. ETS is emission trading system, what we just spoke about. The other is carbon tax. So carbon tax is when the government of a country decides, okay, you know what, for every unit of carbon or GHG that you are emitting, you will have to pay this much tax. So what will happen is people will try to limit the amount of tax that they are, paying to the government in lieu of emissions. Therefore, they sort of end up reducing the emissions, right? So here, if you notice, India has not really subscribed to either, so it's not part of the carbon market yet. But this map sort of shows the arrangements that people have. Most countries either have it implemented or they have scheduled it for implementation. Our nearby neighboring country China has implemented it, or scheduled it for implementation. I don't really know, one of the two. So it's underway, right? So Pakistan is actually considering it. So it's sort of in the works for implementing it. So, however, this is a map, uh, World Bank's dashboard that sort of gives you an idea. So let's take a look at this. Of what is the current status of carbon pricing. So again, so when you're buying these permits, the cost of these permits will vary according to country. So some countries it might be very, very costly because they have very few permits to give away, right? And they really require it. So, or say some countries very environmentally conscious. What they do is, say country A is giving these permits at $100. Country B might think, so this is in case of trans country or trans jurisdiction. Say one part of the country is saying, okay, I'll price it at $100. The other one is like, you know what, $50 is fine. Like I will give you the permits for $50. Just give me the money. I want to make a bit of money. But country A is more environment conscious. They don't really require the revenue. They're thinking, I'm going to do more for the environment, right? So it's also political. It's not as simple as, good-hearted, oh, this is good for the environment. It's also about a political stance. Certain governments, certain pockets of people prefer governments that are more environment friendly. So those are vote banks. It's a complicated political mechanism also, right? But in this dashboard, the link for it will be shared in the PPT as well. So they sort of show the status in the past as well. So it's a very useful dashboard. It's something that you can probably employ in case you want to convey it or just learn about out of curiosity, right? So I just thought I'll share it with you. In case of India, currently there are talks, like it is in the process actually. So this map is slightly outdated. This we are currently sort of thinking of introducing emission trading scheme in India. So that's under the talks right now. Any queries regarding carbon trading, emission trading? So that is where this term comes in, right? Emission trading, forex trading, and energy trade. Energy trading, I really don't know. I haven't heard of it. Forex trading is an economic term, like a financial market term, rather. Emission trading is what cap and trade system comes from. So cap and trade is when you set a limit and then they can trade for the limits, for the permits. I hope that's clear. All right, moving on to the next question. Match the group 1 with group 2 and choose the correct option. Sorry for the bad English. So group 1 is sort of lists environmental protocols or agreements or frameworks, and group 2 gives the provisions that are associated with them. So any answers? If you don't know the whole thing, you can also match like P1, Q2. I say you can give me individual answers also. I'm sorry, 1 second. Any answers? All right, let's see what each one is. So the first option is Montreal Protocol, right? So Montreal Protocol actually is focusing on substances that deplete the ozone layer. So this is a very, very important protocol that keeps coming up time and again. You will have to remember this even apart from the course actually. It's something that's very widely popularly referred to. The second one is Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement, which was in 2015, actually focuses on its mission was to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade and pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5 degrees centigrade, right? So the third one is REDD. So in fact, this is the full form, right? REDD is for reducing degradation and deforestation. Okay? So that's the full form of REDD itself, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the fourth one is Kyoto Protocol. So Kyoto Protocol sort of deals with emission trading and stuff. Do we have a raised hand? Yes, please. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, I think that was a mistake. Yes, yes, please. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Mr. Narayana Bellam, is there a question? Okay, so there were answers actually. Sorry, I didn't notice. Is there a question? Okay, put down there. Please let me know if there is a question. Right. So, so these are the answers essentially, right? So Montreal Protocol is actually related to depletion of the ozone layer. Paris Agreement is 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees Celsius. Red is deforestation and forest degradation, and the Kyoto Protocol deals with emission trading. So that's our answer. B. Any queries? Yeah, Q is 4. Right. All right, moving on to the next question. Kyoto Protocol is sort of redundant now that it is being pointed out, but Kyoto Protocol is related to ozone depletion, hazardous waste, climate change, and nuclear energy. Any answers? Yeah, you've raised your hand. Any queries, Mr. Narayana Bellam? Okay, so I think it was just to give an answer, right? You can just give the answer. Yes, the answer is C. You're right. It is essentially climate change because we are dealing with change in temperatures, right? Yes, all of you are right. The answer is C. Moving on to the next question. So, with respect to emission reduction goal, what does NDC stand for? You can answer. You don't have to put up your hand. So, okay, we have three answers. Okay, so the answer is actually uh, A, nationally determined contributions. I'll explain as to why. So, if you remember, Paris Agreement is one of those agreements where we sort of, it's a legally binding agreement. If you remember, I had mentioned. We had also sort of spoken about how there is no enforcement mechanism, right? But they made a smart move. So, what happens is usually when you ask countries to do something, very rigidly, the mechanism often fails, right? People don't meet it, and people are also discouraged. What happens is they end up overshooting the target, and then they just keep going. Now that we have overshot the target, what does it matter, right? However, in the Paris Agreement, there was a very smart arrangement that was come to. Every country had to give what is called a nationally determined contribution. So the nation determines what it is going to contribute. So this is the target. They have set their targets, saying, you know what, let's limit the rise below 2 degrees and try to keep it below 1.5 if possible. So this is the target. So countries can sort of come up with their own plans. These plans will be taking into consideration both this, yes, we need to keep the temperature low, but also every country has its economic goals, right? Like there are a lot of other clashing interests that coming in. Everybody also wants to develop, right? So they sort of have to come up with a list of goals, list of targets, saying, you know what, I'm going to do these things to achieve this target that the Paris Agreement has set in. Right. So the NDCs are actually nationally determined contributions. So the nation determines the contribution. It's as simple as that, right? So in fact, say what happens with the Paris Agreement being informed. So right now, say whatever we are doing right now, if we continue down this path, we'll end up in this curve. So like CO2 emissions will sort of be in this curve. But and why are we worried about CO2 emissions? Because greenhouse gas emissions are sort of uh, leading to a greenhouse gas effect, if you remember from school science, that encapsulates more heat or like retains more heat in the, on Earth. With the presence of GHGs sort of lead to that. Right? So, however, if you want to go down, like if you want to make sure the globe's temperature rise is limited to 2 degrees, this is the path that we need to be taking. Well, right now with all the climate pledges, so these pledges are the NDCs, right? If we follow these, even then we'll sort of be somewhere here. But the other issue is whether we will actually follow through with these pledges, right? So currently the Paris Agreement has been ratified by 192 countries, actually 193 countries as of February. So Eritrea is an African country. So Eritrea is the latest addition to this list. They sort of joined the agreement or ratified the agreement in February, right? I think this one's Eritrea, right? However, this is Yemen, this is Iran, and this is Libya. These countries have signed on to the UNFCCC, but they've not really ratified the Paris Agreement, right? So India is obviously one of the countries that has already agreed to it. So one second. There is another tool by Climate Watch. So it's called Climate Watch Data. So this is a very, very interesting website. It sort of keeps track of several things, right? First of all, this is the ratification status, if you remember. So this is by Climate Watch. This is according to the status of ratification. This is INDC. So INDC is intended nationally determined contribution. So that's another uh, term. So what happens is there are several levels of nationally determined contributions that can be there. So you can update your contribution after a few years, right? So I think which is also present here. I'm not wrong. Okay, if you notice here, these are countries that have given only first NDC. There are countries that have given a new NDC, like that doesn't mean always revised. these are NDCs that have come in the recent past. So there are countries that have given intended NDC, intended NDCs. They've sort of given an outline as to, okay, you know what, this is what it is going to be, but I don't know if I will actually for like submit this as my final, right? So and of course, Libya has not even given an intended NDC. So these countries that have not ratified, so you can see this one, Iran and Yemen, they have not agreed to the commitment yet, but they've submitted their NDCs nonetheless. So those are called INDCs, right? So yeah, so that's another interesting website that you can use. So this is again another infographic to just show where are we. So when we say we should keep the increase to 2 degrees, what we mean is from this pre-industrial baseline. So this has been set, right? So if this is our target by the Paris Agreement, we are currently, with whatever we are doing here, we are currently here, right? But with current NDCs that have been sort of given, this is where we'll reach, hopefully. But which means countries really need to, improve their NDCs. If you remember, even from the lectures, there have been a lot of protests saying governments need to make more commitments towards this. Right? So this is a short video. I don't know if it is just explaining what NDCs are.
What are nationally determined contributions? The Paris Agreement empowers countries to limit the global average temperature increase to as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible to strengthen climate resilience and ensure financial flows are consistent with these goals. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, form the basis for countries to achieve Paris Agreement objectives. NDCs embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. They communicate the ambitious efforts that a country will undertake to address climate change.
So this is what they're essentially, they end up being. They sort of reflect as to how ambitious a country is. So how does it matter? Like how does it matter if you're so ambitious or least ambitious? So it is actually linked to something called carbon credit. So what we saw was carbon emission trading and carbon pricing, right? Carbon credit is when there are certain grants or funds that are given to a country or given to organizations based on how environment friendly they are. So investments, there are certain investments or investors that think, okay, you know what, I'll give money for your business, but only if you are environment friendly. Or there are others that say you need to be human rights friendly. So that is where this ambitious effort part comes in. So the countries that reflect, like show that they're very environment friendly, they get better funding for their projects and for technology improvement. Sometimes the promise might be technology transfer. So some other country has a better technology. For example, India ratifies a lot of these environmental, agreements because you get technology transfer. So those countries sort of conceal their technology. Like technological details are not, they're sort of secrets, right? So, however, if we end up signing on to certain agreements, there is a pact that, okay, you can get a bit of technology transfer. We'll tell you how. So,
NDCs are nationally determined so that countries can put forward the most ambitious contributions that their national circumstances allow. NDCs contain information on targets, policies and measures for reducing national emissions and on adapting to climate change impacts such as floods or droughts. Some NDCs also contain information on either the needs for or the provision of finance, technologies and capacity building to enable ambitious climate actions. Countries communicate new or updated NDCs every 5 years starting in 2020. In doing so, they follow guidance adopted in Katowice in 2018 on information to facilitate clarity, transparency and understanding of NDCs. Subsequent NDCs should be more ambitious and not backslide to lower ambition. This is how, at a global level, our actions become more and more ambitious towards reaching the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Communicated NDCs are recorded in a registry maintained by UN Climate Change.
yeah, that's just a short video. Right. So this is what India had promised from our side. So this was our first nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, which was submitted in August 2022, right? So we had given our INDC, so intended nationally determined contribution, I think around 2020. So, however, right now we've made these commitments. Okay, so, yeah, that's just to give an idea. You don't really have to remember these. These are just for you to know, right? Any queries regarding this? Okay, let's just move on to the next question. Which of the following will qualify for the green list? Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna Flora, Framework Convention on Climate Change, Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, or Convention on Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal. Okay, we have one answer. Any other responses? Okay, you're absolutely right. That's the answer. So how do we determine which one is which? Anything that's nature related is usually a green list, and anything that's human activity related is a brown list. So this sort of came up. We also call it the green agenda and the brown agenda. It became an environmental movement ka term. These two terms became part of it around, I think, 1970s, when, if you remember Indira Gandhi's speech about isn't poverty the worst polluter, right? So it sort of sparked a debate, and post which these two terms emerged, where it's not just about the environment. Like, environment could not mean just nature; it could also mean human environment. Like, that was the brown list argument. Green list primarily focuses on nature. So if you look at the list here, so here this is primarily the aspect that's focusing on nature alone and non-human rather. So climate change has been widely said to be a human-induced activity, right? Ozone layer, again, GHG emissions, widely assumed to be a human-induced activity. So these are all, we're not saying they're not caused by natural processes also, but the issue is with the human causes of it. Right? Again, hazardous waste and disposal is also a human activity. So the answer is A. Any queries? All right, let's move on to the next question. Which of the following powers are conferred by MOEFCC, this is the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, by EPA Act of 1986? Environmental clearance, eco-sensitive zone, coastal regulation zone, or infrastructure development. So we have a few options. Okay, okay. Any other responses? Okay, you're right. Uh, is there a B is the answer? Someone has raised their hand again. So the answer is actually B. If you, it's a direct answer from this list, right? So this list is given in the presentation. So infrastructure development is not something that is actually uh, conferred to MOEFCC. Understandably, uh, so these two are directly, almost directly, the purview of, environmental clearance, environment related. Makes sense that E will happen. Coastal regulation zone, which I could have actually presented, I didn't really think about it. So coastal regulation zone is where, say, you have, India, bad drawing of India, sorry, but there is not just the coast, but any water body also. Say there is a river here, right? So there is an extent to which there is a certain extent to which construction is sort of limited, right? So here also throughout the coast. think up to 50 meters there is a particular restriction. Up to 100 meters there's a particular restriction. So that is the coastal regulation zone, which is also a very environmental thing, right? So it's the restriction of development. Infrastructure development as such is not coming under the MOEFCC. So the answer is B, in fact. Right? Any queries? Let's move on to the next question. Match the following with examples. Uh, which of these the group 2 is are the examples? So what is New Zealand RMA, European Directive, Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and NEPA, which is the US National Environmental Protection Act, then India's Environmental Protection Act 1986. Any answers? Even if you know them partially, you can sort of give the answers. So we have one answer. Okay, let's see what the options are. Mr. Narayana, you don't have to raise your hand to give answers. You can just, you have to raise your hand if you want to ask something verbally. But if it's in the chat box, you don't have to raise your hand. You can type in the chat box. Is there a question? Do you want to ask something? All right. So this is the slide which sort of gives the options, right? So yes, you are right. The answer is C. So the general environment law is NEPA or Indian Environmental Protection Act, right? So if you look at the comprehensive resource management and planning law, it's actually famous for this New Zealand RMA for being, it's sort of a comprehensive resource management one. So it's New Zealand RMA. Enabling or framework law is this one, the European directive. So it sort of gives directions as to how the EA has to be. And there is a prescriptive EA law, which is Canadian environmental. So the answer is C. Right? Moving on to the next question. After this, we'll probably take a break. Right? So state true or false. Primary environmental policies are the ones whose primary goals are concerned with environment, while secondary policies are the ones whose primary goals are not non-environmental. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, both of you are right. The answer is true. So primary environmental policy includes environmental policy goals. Yes. Secondary environmental policy is it's a non-environmental goal with environmental implications, right? It's a direct question from the slides. All right. So before we go to this match the following, let's take a short break uh, for 5 minutes, right? And we'll meet around 7. So it's 7:02 in my clock. So, yeah. Right, let's continue with the session. Yeah, moving on to the next question. Match the terms with its meaning. I hope my audio is on. Yeah. So group one has a few terms associated with EIA and environmental law, policy, and institutional arrangements in general. And group two has its associated meanings. Any responses? Even if you know partial answers, you can type them out. Okay, we have one response. Okay, let's see what each one means, right? So cluster of policy actually points to collection of policy instruments all designed to achieve a common goal or set of intentions. So it's basically a set of policies, like cluster as a set. That's how you can easily remember. The others are also approaches and policy instruments that ma'am sort of spoke about, right? So technology and emission standards are command and control. Command and control is sort of the opposite of what a carbon market does, right? Command and control is when you say, okay, you don't have a choice, you have to limit your emissions to this level, or yeah, or your performance need to be a certain standards. The standards are set by the government, therefore it's called as command and control, right? So let's move on. Since these have been spoken about, let's move on to the answers, right? So cluster of policy is actually, yes, collection of policy instruments because it's a collection. That's how you find out. Command and control is the uh, technology part of it, right? So technology, emissions, or ecosystem restoration standards, right? So this is how you sort of figure out which one is which. Planning regime is when essentially planning regimes are what they sound like. These are planning documents or planning, initiatives. So strategies or actions plans designed to achieve ambient air quality. Like this is an example of planning regimes, right? And market interventions is when you use some sort of market tool. So as this says, including economic instructions such as taxes, fees, or markets for tradable emission rights, as well as loans and subsidies. So these all come under market interventions. So the answer is actually D. Any queries here? I know it takes a bit of reading, but it's not that difficult to figure out either. Okay, moving on to the next question. Sorry, I typed the wrong number. Question 30. State true or false. Montreal Protocol addressed stratospheric O3 depletion and became the first United Nations Convention to be ratified by all UN member states. Is it true or false? Okay. We have a few answers. Any other response? Okay, all of you are right. The answer is true. So Montreal Protocol, if you remember, deals with substances that deplete the ozone layer. Right. So it's very famous actually for being the first UN convention to be ratified by all the member states. Right. So the answer is true. So this is again general information. It's sort of a timeline of goals. The thing with Montreal Protocol is the targets are all ozone depleting substances. Yes, so all of these have a different phasing out period, right? It was initially halon and then chlorofluorocarbons, and then HFCs came into the picture, then HCFCs came into the picture. So these are all different greenhouse ozone depleting substances rather. So right, so this is just a timeline for your general information. All right. Moving on to the next question. Select the mandatory law, policies, or guidelines on air quality for a country in the following options. So, which of these are basically mandatory? That's the question. If you remember, not all instruments are mandatory, right? Okay. We have one answer. Any other responses? Okay. Okay. We have a few varied responses. So the answer is actually A. So the easiest way to remember this is any guideline is usually not mandatory, right? All guidelines are guidelines, like this, they're just recommendations, or they're there to guide you. They're not mandatory. Usually, acts are mandatory. Usually, right? And best practices, good practices are again usually not mandatory, right? So this is again from this slide. These three are advisories or recommendations, and then we have these so standards, limit values, act. These are all mandatory. Any queries? So the answer is A. Let's move on to the next question. Which is the full form of ppm with respect to air quality? Parts per million, production per million, pollution per million, or particulate matter per million? Okay. We have one answer. So we have two answers, and both of you are right. The answer is A. So there are two of them. Uh, One is mass by volume, the other is volume by volume, right? So these are the two expressions of concentration that we have. And usually we use parts per million or parts per billion. ppb is parts per billion, right? So the answer is A. Depending on what the matter being spoken about is, there is usually a conversion value also between them. Moving on to the next question. State true or false. CPCB provides air quality standards for ecologically sensitive areas also. Is it true or false? Okay. We have a few answers. Any other responses? Okay. All of you are right. The answer is true. So if you remember, so I know the quality is really bad, but this is where the answer comes from. So they're talking about the pollutant time weighted average concentration in both industrial, residential, rural, and other areas. And then this is the ecologically sensitive areas, and then methods of measurement. So they provide concentration in ambient air for both uh, other areas as well as ecologically sensitive areas. So this is from the National Ambient Air Quality Status and Trends 2019. If you notice here, they have for everything that they've, this is just a sample, right? So for everything, they usually show ecologically sensitive areas. So that's separate, the values are separately given. Because the standards are also lesser. If you actually can read this table, it's lesser than the normal areas, right? I mean, and again, makes sense because these areas are actually sensitive. So these are the values, right? So you can download the notification always and then take a look. So the answer is true. Moving on to the next question. Parameters related with odor are abbreviated as, so there is a usual abbreviation that is in practice, FDIOL, DOLFI, FIDOL, or IDOLF. Any answers? Okay, so the answer is actually FIDOL, FIDOL. It's frequency, intensity, duration, odor, unpleasantness, and location. So, yeah, the answer is FIDOL, right? Moving on to the next question. CPCB, which keeps coming again, time and again, what does it stand for? Central Processing Control Board, Central Pollution and Coastal Branch, Center of Pollution and Control Board, Central Pollution Control Board. This is a straightforward answer. Again, these are terms that we'll have to know. So, right? So some of you are right. The answer is actually D. So it keeps coming time and again in all the slides, right? So Central Pollution Control Board. In fact, we also in most states we also have State Pollution Control Board, right? Yeah. Moving on to the next question. What does UNEP in a context of EIA stand for? United National Environment Program, United Nations Ecological Program, United Nations Environment Program, and United Nations Ecology Program. Actually, United Nations. But all right. Okay, the answer is actually C, United Nations Environment Program. So the another interesting resource from the United Nations Environment Program is this timeline. So it has all the major milestones from 50 years. Interestingly, it actually has Indira Gandhi's picture from the Stockholm conference, right? Very interesting that they chose that. So it sort of gives you all the major milestones. So 1980s, 1968, UN sort of takes up environmental issues. Then what happens next? So the entire thing is sort of given here, right? It's a very interesting resource if you want to take a look at it. The latest one is this. Uh, sorry, this is the latest one. Right. 2021 to 2030 has been declared as the decade on ecosystem restoration. Right. So this is the latest announcement. Before that, we have what UNEP releases a report called Making Peace with Nature. So this is a very interesting timeline to sort of keep track of the events that have happened in the 50 years of UNEP. Right. As of 2022, it sort of turned 50. So I just thought I'll share it with you. So yeah, the answer is United Nations Environment Program. I'm so sorry again. Okay. So before we move on to the current run week 3 assignment questions, which we'll quickly move through, any queries regarding the week's contents or any general queries, any requests, recommendations? How do you want the sessions to be? Okay, another thing that I've noticed in general is people don't really know where to access the videos and the recordings from. So, so if this is your course homepage, right? If you look at the left tab, you'll see all the hyperlinks for the videos and all the course contents. This is where all the videos are. So, problem solving session. And you can click here to view the Excel sheet, which will be updating every week, right? So, like I will be uploading week 3 ka content here. So this is the YouTube link and this is the presentation folder link. So for example, my presentation folder is this one. right? And then you can sort of access the PDF. Why is it not opening? Okay, I think my internet is slightly cut. 1 second. There is a minor interruption. Sorry. Yeah, so I hope I'm audible again, right? Yeah. So this is the folder where all my presentations can be found. Right, this is the week 2 presentation. You can download the PDF. Uh, for every page, I usually have included the sources unless and until the page is coming from the presentations of the course. The sources are mentioned here, right? You can always access them. Uh, so yes, and this is where you can find the recorded session videos, right? So this is Miss Isha's and this is mine. You can find both the recordings given right there, right? So that's just to let you know. All right. So any other queries, any requests, anything? All right. If not, we'll move on to the current run week 3 assignment questions, right? So match the following global environment from the global environment timeline, right? So these are the events or agreements or whatnot, and these are the years in which they happen. Any responses? Even if you know one of them, you can respond in the chat box. Okay, let's move on to the answers. Let me not prompt you for too many answers this time. I'll just rush through the answers because you must be having access to these already, right? So 1973, we had UN clause. So UN clause is the uh, abbreviation of this, right? United Nations Conference on Law of the Sea, right? 1974, we had this one. I think this is also part of, right? United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Wild Fauna and Flora. So this is called CITES, right? So, so Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It's called CITES. Uh, 1976, United Nations Conference on Human Settlements in Vancouver. Mind it. So the first one happened in I think 1972 only, but this one happened in 1976, right? So then we have the Amoco Cadiz spill, oil spill. Brittany is in France, right? So these are our answers. So 1973 is UN clause. 1974 is CITES. 1976 is UNCHS Vancouver, and then you have the Amoco Cadiz spill, right? So the answer is C. Okay, moving on to the next question. Again, a set of events, and then so you will have to remember these. I know it can sound scary, but you will have to remember them for the examination. So again, let's see what all are there. So the Convention on Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution is adopted in 1979, right? So this one. And then you have World Conservation Strategy by the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, the abbreviation as IUCN. this one, the report publishes a section on towards sustainable development. Right? Again, once again, for those of you who have joined it late, in order to remember all of these, apart from the lecture, there is an additional resource, which is the Asian Development Bank World Sustainable Development Timeline Report, right? So now most of the content from the slides comes from this. Uh, I'm not saying all the points are covered, but most of the points are covered, right? If you notice, for example, 1973 UN clause is the first point, but the other points might not be covered, right? So this is a good, you can just take a printout of it, highlight which ones are there. There are a few additional ones also that ma'am has pointed out. You can just add it to them, and then this sort of becomes your resource for studying. It's quite comprehensive, right? So coming back, so World Conservation Strategy report, which talks about sustainable development, is in 1980. 1981, we have Global Strategy for Health for All for the target year 2000. And then 1984 is when we have the Bhopal gas tragedy, right? I changed it in this slide. I did not change it in this slide. So, yeah, so the answer is C, which means P is 1981. We had, rather, I'll go it this way. 1979, we have transboundary air pollution. 1980, we have World Conservation Strategy. 1981, we have Global Strategy for Health for All. And 84 is when the Bhopal gas tragedy happened, right? So again, a set of events. Let's We are talking about Wangari Maathai winning the Nobel Prize, Kyoto Protocol. So Kyoto Protocol's original year is not this. I know it's from 97, but which means we are looking at an associated year, right? Kyoto Protocol also underwent subsequent meetings also, right? So then UN Climate Change Conference Bali, and then Paris Agreement COP21. Is there a question? Somebody has unmuted themselves. If you don't have a query, can you please mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So yeah, so 2004 is when Wangari Maathai won the first. She is the first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So this was for the Green Belt movement, right? So then Kyoto Protocol, we had a meeting in 2005. So the thing is, Kyoto Protocol actually came up in 97, but it was entering into force in 2005, which means 2005 is also a very significant year for Kyoto Protocol, right? And 2007 is when the United Nations Climate Change Conference happened in Bali. And 2015, we have the COP21. So the answers are 2004, Wangari Maathai, uh, sorry, 2005 is Kyoto Protocol, 2007 is Bali, and then 2015 is Paris COP21, Paris Agreement after COP21. So the answer is C. Okay. Please stop me if you have any queries. I'm just going to run through the answers mostly. Right? So, yeah. Question number 4, state true or false, or we can even request responses for a few of them. In 2003, United Nations General Assembly endorsed the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. Is it true or false? Any answers? So this is similar to what we saw here, right? 2021 to 30 is the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Yes, you are right, Mr. Yogendra. The answer is true. So 2003, they sort of launched the United Nations Decade for of Education for Sustainable Development. Right? So it was uh, also called the United Nations Literacy Decade. Right? So the answer is true. Moving on to the next question. In 2005, Millennium Ecosystem Assessments, or MEA, was released. Is it true or false? Did it happen in 2005? Any responses? Okay, we have one response. You are right, Mr. Pawan Kumar. The answer is true. In 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was actually released. It was a major assessment of the human impact on environment, right? So, yeah, the answer is true. Moving on to the next question. Match the stages in the EIA notification 2006 prior environmental clearance process for new projects. Right? So, which is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. If we remember the basic structure of EIA, then this should be easy. So the answer actually comes from this slide. Right? So you first screen, scope, public consultation, and appraisal. So if you remember the basic structure of EIA, this answer is easy. Right? So stage 1 is screening, stage 2 is scoping, stage 3 is public consultation, and stage 4 is appraisal. Right? Appraisal is when you assess the merits of the project. Moving on to the next question. The foundation for the effective EIA system are foundations. Clear basis in law and regulation, clear basis of objectives and statements, mandatory compliance and enforcement, and comprehensive scope of application to proposals with potentially significant impact. Okay, we have one answer, D. Okay, let's see what the answer is. So this is again, it's almost like a standard set of theoretical questions, right? And the answer is in fact D. If you notice, sorry, if you notice, the sort of the first four of this list, right? So the answer is D. So there are three more which you will have to remember. Right? Any queries? Moving on to the next question. National Ambient Air Quality Standard or guidelines for number of common pollutants differ with respect to uh, pollutant target, concentration level, averaging time, and measurement protocols. So, so these are the parameters based on which air quality standards are sort of prescribed, right? Or guidelines are prescribed. Which of these belong to that list? If you remember from the previous slide on national ambient air quality standards, the one in India, if you remember that table itself, you should be able to remember this, right? Okay, we have a few answers. So, and the previous answer also, Mr. Pawan Kumar was right? So, here the answer is D. Yes, all of them are, both of you are right. All of them are part of the list. So, this is the extended list, right? So, these are the usual parameters along which we sort of not like not all of them need to be present, but it's usually one or more of these, right? So, for example, say some document might prescribe these and then not have stringency difficulty. We don't know, like, but this is how usually these are prescribed. So the answer is D. All of these are present in that list. Right? Any queries? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Match the following definitions: governance, policy, and policy instrument. What do these mean? So which one is this one? Statement of intent to change behavior in a positive way. So the keyword here is intent, right? And then here the key is the means or a specific measure. Oh God, I'm so sorry. So it's a specific measure or a means to translate that into action. So you have intent, action, and then the process whereby societies or organizations make important decisions, determine whom they involve and how they render. So this is the process, right? Oh, we have a few answers. Okay, most of the answers are right. The answer is actually C. So policy, this is from this slide, if you remember. These are definitions that you need to remember. So policy is always the intent, right? So Q is one. Policy is the intent. Then we have the policy instrument. What do you use? How do you like sort of attain the intent? It's through some means or a specific measure. So policy is the intent. R is two. Governance is the process or the setup through which you sort of make sure these decisions are taken, and it's the operationalization, if you want to say that, right? So the answer is in fact C. Any queries regarding this? Okay. So moving on to the next question. Types of policy instruments. So which of these are types of policy instruments rather? Regulations and regulatory policy standards, market-based instrument, research and development, and treaties and agreements. Any answers? Okay, we have one answer, and you are right actually. So this is the list of the types of policy instruments. So we have legislation and regulatory policies or standards, market-based instruments, financial incentives or disincentives, voluntary approaches, treaties and agreements, international soft law, voluntary agreements, research and development, and information instruments. The answer is actually D. Both of you are right. So all of these are types of policy instruments. So these are essentially tools with which we implement policy, right? Moving on to the next question. Objectives of NAMP, National Air Quality Monitoring Program, India are. Which of these are objectives of NAMP? To determine status and trends of ambient air quality, to ascertain whether the prescribed ambient air quality standards are violated, to identify non-attainment cities, and to obtain the knowledge and understanding necessary for developing preventive and corrective measures. Yes, all of you are right. So this is sort of the page to access the program's homepage. Right? So these are the objectives, right? So four of these have been listed there. So the answer is D. But there are actually five of them, right? So to understand the natural cleansing process, it's not included here. Undergoing in the environment through pollution, dilution, dispersion, wind-based movement, dry deposition, precipitation, and chemical transformation of pollutants generated. So it's not just about the pollutants being there, but also about like how do these processes act on the pollutants also. So that's also part of one of their objectives, right? So the answer is D. Any queries? All right. So the next question: match the odor recognized as a nuisance in the industries under Schedule 1 of the Environment Protection Rules 1986. Sorry about the grammar. Any answers? So this is for fermentation industries, natural rubber industries, large pulp and paper mill, coffee processing. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, let's see what the answer is. So for fermentation industries, all efforts should be made to remove odor. So that will make it P2, right? So then we have natural rubber industries, or odor should be absent, completely absent, right? So for large pulp and paper mills, the hydrogen sulfide, which is the odorous component, should be limited to 10 milligrams per cubic meter, right? Right. And for coffee processing, we have no complaints norms, but public complaints are usually received. So the answer is correct. So yeah. So S is 3, this one, odor should be absent and all effort should be made to remove odor. Any queries? Both of you are right. The answer is. This can be sort of remembered even commonsensically, to be honest. The idea being that natural rubber industries, the odor might actually be very toxic, the components coming out and giving odor. Fermentation industries, it's not about toxin, it's more about nuisance, right? So their effort should be put in. For large pulp and paper mills, this component is probably common in the processing. Therefore, it's being explicitly stated. And of course, coffee processing probably needs to be addressed, right? Okay, so we've come to the end of the session, right? So I are there any queries in general? So if there are any queries regarding the taught content also, that's also fine. Any suggestions? Anything else that you would like to discuss? So like I said, these are the oh, I stopped sharing this. Sorry. These are some of the resources that I've shared mainly today. One is the Asian Development Bank's Sustainable Development Timeline, sort of useful for preparation for the first two lectures. Then you have the carbon pricing dashboard, which is very interesting when it comes to, if you remember, emission trading and carbon pricing, and carbon taxes. So climatewatchdata.org sort of hosts everything about the Paris Climate Agreement, and they also have various other resources. If you like top 10 greenhouse emitters, and all of these are good resources to use. And you also have the United Nations Environment Program का timeline, 50-year timeline, right? So, yeah, these are the extra resources that we have shared today. But I hope these resources are sort of generally helpful to for you in like not necessarily part of the learning process, but even in otherwise in your presentations and all. So that's the reason why I keep sharing these. Is there a question?
If you see the last
Yes,
one,
yes, you can ask your query.
areas are shaded on the
Sure.
line between
Miss Jayasili Malar is okay. You muted yourself. Mr. Narayana Bellam, do you have a query? Do you have a question? Do you have a suggestion? Anything?
Ma'am, I'm attending another course on this SWAYAM or NBTEL, but
Okay.
simultaneously it is same time I'm also attending
Oh,
environmental impact assessment and methodology in natural science. But
okay.
I'm really find difficult the same time they have kept.
Oh, the interaction session.
Ah, yes, ma'am.
Oh,
So
that's
I'm
great.
attending
Okay.
assessment in environment, so both in laptop as well as in the mobile. So it
Oh,
is.
okay. Okay,
So
so
I'm taking
what you can, I would
screenshot.
suggest, okay, I understand. What you can do is, we have two sessions for this course, right? So we have
Ah,
one
yes.
session on Saturday. Although the content is not going to be the same, we
Yeah.
will be posting a recording of these sessions in
Ah,
YouTube,
okay.
and if I think it's posted on the website also. I'll do something. Do you know how to access the discussion forum?
Ah, yes, ma'am.
So there I will be making a post today. But even
Ah, yes,
otherwise,
ma'am.
let me actually share the screen. So in your homepage, the course homepage,
Yes, ma'am.
if you look at it here, so left is where you have all the videos, right?
Ah,
If you
yes,
see
ma'am.
this, you have this problem solving. You don't have to call me ma'am. So you have this problem solving session, right? So
Ah,
yeah, here if you click on the thing that comes up, right, like there is a tab that comes up after you click on problem solving session.
ah,
Then if
yes,
you
ma'am.
click here, you actually have the list of all the resources that happens in these additional sessions. So this is
Okay.
where you can find the presentations. This is the Google Drive. So all my PDFs are uploaded here, which means all the links, all the content, everything is available here.
Oh,
Right. So and these are the videos. Okay. So
okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
yeah. So you can sort of access these, and every week ka recording is available. The other session ka recording is also available in this list.
Ah, yes, ma'am.
So
Thank you, ma'am.
yeah, I'll also be making a post today because a lot of people seem to be missing out on this.
Ah, yes, ma'am.
I'll be
Thank you.
putting it up in the discussion forum, so you can choose to attend the other one, right?
Ah, thank you,
So
ma'am.
yeah. Mr. Pawan Kumar, did you have a question? You raised your hand again. All right, if there are no other queries, we can close for the day. I will be available for the next 10 minutes just in case, but yeah, in case there are any other queries, anything else, any suggestions. You can also post your questions, Ms. Jayasili, if you're not attending the session, you can post your questions in the discussion forum and I will be addressing them here also. So you can look at the explanation later. Or if you have some query about the session, also you can post it in the discussion forum saying, okay, you can just attach the YouTube link, mention the time, saying, okay, I don't know, I don't understand this or what is happening here. So you can always do that. So I'll get back to you with an explanation, right? All right then. So thank you all for joining the session. I hope it's useful in general also beyond the course, and I hope I'm contributing to your learning experience as well. You can reach out to either of us anytime via the discussion forum. Like you can specifically mention my name and request for an explanation also. Apart from that, I don't have anything to add. Any of you have anything else to add? You can bring it up. Otherwise, have a good evening. Have a good night wherever you are. Thank you for joining.